Brighton there. Now, when I was a young correspondent in Belfast in the early 1970s, sectarian hatred was turning into a bitter civil war that lasted for the next 30 years. There was a peace process then, of course, and power sharing, but it was a generation before there was a real breakthrough. Sectarianism, however, is never far beneath the surface in Northern Ireland. So how safe is it now? The threat level in Northern Ireland remains at severe, with 24 national security attacks during 2012. In July last year, a number of disparate groups came together to form an organisation referred to as the new IRA. And just this week, police stopped a van equipped with 4 mortar bombs that was potentially minutes away from launching a dissident Republican attack. Then, in the latest act of loyalist public disorder concerning the flying of the Union Jack outside Belfast City Hall, 100 people attacked the police on Friday night in Newtonabbey. More than 140 police officers have been injured since the protests began, with over 170 arrests and 125 charges. The annual marching season of parades begins around Easter, and shortly after, the eyes of the world were turned to Northern Ireland for the G8 summit in June. What can the Secretary of State do to keep the peace? And the Northern Ireland Secretary, Theresa Villiers, joins me now. Welcome to the Sunday Politics. Is the security situation in Northern Ireland improving or getting worse?
It continues to be a severe threat. Since around 2008-2009, there's been a very significant problem with terrorism in Northern Ireland. These groups are very small. They enjoy almost no public support, but they have lethal intent. And tragically, we saw that manifested in the murder of a prison officer last year. It was only through the swift action of the Police Service of Northern Ireland that we saw a major terrorist attack thwarted just this week.
Which paramilitary group, in your view, poses the biggest threat?
Well, there are a range of terrorist groupings. Your package referred to the so-called new IRA. They are amongst
are they the
2 or 3. There are a number of different groupings.
We know there are a number of different groupings.
Called ONH is
what is
also
the biggest threat to security?
They're all a threat. All of the terrorist groupings are a threat, and that's why we remain vigilant and entirely supportive of the PSNI and its partners in countering this threat.
Well, we have the new IRA, so-called. The loyalist demonstrations have been taking place as well over the argument about the flag on Belfast City Hall. Situation seems to be worse than it's been for a couple of years. Are you going to have to take new measures to deal with this growing threat?
We have remained vigilant throughout. One of the reasons one of the consequences of the increase in the threat in around 2008-2009 was that we devoted an extra 200 million to support national security efforts of the PSNI in Northern Ireland. We'll continue to give the PSNI and its partners all the help that they need in combating this threat.
What else can you do?
I think what is very important is the PSNI continue to work very closely with An Garda Síochána. The security relationship between the UK and Ireland and its 2 police services has never been closer, and that is saving lives on a daily basis.
Could you envisage the British Army having to come back onto the streets?
No, I think that's inconceivable. The PSNI receives support from the military in relation, for example, to bomb disposal, as indeed police services across the UK do. Was
Peter Robinson the First Minister in Northern Ireland? Was he right to say that the Northern Ireland police must address a perception that they treat loyalists more severely than Republicans?
Well, Peter Robinson referred to some criticism that had been made of the PSNI within the unionist loyalist community. I have to say I really don't agree with that criticism. I think the PSNI have done an excellent job under difficult circumstances in policing the flags protests. Do
you think he's right to say that the Northern Ireland courts treat loyalists more harshly?
I haven't seen evidence for that, I have to say. You know, these are matters for the judiciary. Inevitably, the judiciary take their own independent decisions. That's all part of respect for the rule of law.
Another marching season will soon be upon us. It's usually a nightmare time for a Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. I've seen many have to go through it, from Willie Whitelaw onwards. How worried should we be?
It's vitally important that everyone in Northern Ireland obeys the rulings of the Parades Commission, who are the regulator in relation to parades. You know, their decisions are always going to be controversial with some parts of the community. They have an incredibly difficult job to do in balancing different perspectives here, but the key thing is the rule of law must be obeyed, Parades Commission decisions must be obeyed.
Do you think it wise, given everything we've just talked about, to be holding the great international G8 summit in a part of our nation that's had 24 national security attacks in a year?
I think it's not only wise, it's a great idea. The Prime Minister is bringing the G8 to Northern Ireland because he wants to showcase Northern Ireland abroad. The reality is, though, the terrorist threat is still significant.
Yeah.
The vast majority of people in Northern Ireland live their lives with a freedom from fear which would have been impossible during the Troubles. Northern Ireland has been transformed over the last 20 years since the first ceasefires. It's a great place to visit, it's a great place to work, to study, and it's a great place to do business, and we'll be showing that to the world during the G8.
Let me bring you now to some politics on this side of the Irish Sea. A new poll of Conservative supporters shows that only 7% think that you can win an overall majority at the next election. 7%. Why is Tory morale so low?
Well, inevitably, in a mid-term for a government that's having to deal with a huge deficit that we inherited from our predecessors, we've had to take difficult decisions.
But this is among your own supporters, Secretary of State.
Clearly, there are, when you take difficult decisions, that sometimes has consequences. They're not always popular, but I think the vast majority of the UK's population recognise that we have to deal with the deficit, that we can't carry on spending far more than we're earning, that this needs to be dealt with. If we don't do it, interest rates will skyrocket.
You may be right or you may be wrong on the policy, but the consequences for your party, even among your own supporters, seems to be quite severe. A huge majority of Tories, 75%, think that Labour will form the next government in 2015. I mean, your supporters have thrown the towel in already. Why?
Well, that's not the feedback I get from the supporters I meet on the ground.
Well, that's the chart from Conservative Home. You see it up there on the screen, Minister. It used to be 38% only in March a year ago. Now 75% of Tory supporters say it's over. Labour will be the next government.
I think there's a huge amount of support for policies to deal with the deficit and get Britain growing again. It was never going to be an easy task that we took on. We inherited a deficit which was larger than at any time in the UK's peacetime history.
Could cost you power, couldn't it?
Of course, we're in business to do the right thing, not necessarily the most popular thing.
Even if you lose in 2015?
We're achieving a huge amount with cutting the deficit by a quarter. 1 million new jobs have been created in the private sector. Immigration is down by a third. Crime is falling.
And still your own people think you're going to lose?
There's a lot that we're achieving, and we are determined that we have to repair the public finances to put this country back on the road to economic recovery.
62% of these Tories also think that stopping defections from your party to UKIP is the biggest challenge you face at the next election. Do you agree with that?
I think it's important to address the UKIP challenge by reminding everyone that David Cameron was the first ever UK Prime Minister to veto a European treaty, and he's the first Prime Minister in over a generation to offer people in Britain a say as to whether we continue to be members of the European Union or whether we don't. You
were one of only 2 shadow ministers at the time to object to the Lib Dems' terms for the coalition. Do you feel vindicated? Actually, as with hindsight, I think that the decision to form a coalition was absolutely the right one. So
You're right.
You were wrong.
I was wrong. I was definitely wrong, because I was, as you say, one of the more sceptical members of the shadow cabinet.
What were you worried about at the time?
I mean, my concern, as you say, was related to a range of things, but actually 2 parties coming together in the national interest has given this country the stable government, which was absolutely essential. What were you worried about
at the time? It's interesting.
Well, I was wanting to look at sort of the options in terms of minority administrations, but I am absolutely convinced now that we did the right thing. David Cameron did absolutely the right thing, and the coalition is working well in many ways. We've just had a bitterly fought by-election, and we're still working well together. That shows the strength of the cooperation between the 2 parties. Some
Tory MPs advocate a parliamentary vote before the election to enable a referendum. It's a way of showing good faith. Even if you lose, it shows your party wants a referendum. It would stave off the UKIP threat. Why is that a bad idea?
Well, I mean, that's one of ideas that's been kicking around. I mean, obviously, to get that kind of referendum through Parliament would be difficult because we're the only party promising a referendum.
It's not necessary to get it through. It's simply to establish good faith, and then you say if you really want a referendum, you have to vote Conservative. Why is that a bad idea?
Well, I think that the key message for people in the next general election is if you want to say on the European Union, then you need to vote for the Conservatives because we're the only party that's offering people a choice.
So why don't you at least try to get one through in this Parliament? A lot of your colleagues are arguing for this. What's the case against?
Well, I think it's what is important, an important part of the package that David Cameron is putting forward, is that he wants the opportunity to negotiate a new relationship with Europe, which has a stronger focus on the trading links and the commerce, which people thought that they were voting for back in the mid-70s.
Wouldn't stop you voting for a referendum now and then having one afterwards, would it?
I think the important thing is that we achieve that referendum for the British people so that they can have the final say.
OK, Theresa Villiers, thank you very much.